Hi, my friends. This is the Saturday edition of the Romanov Dynasty of Russia, a series where we discuss the service role that the Romanov Grand Dukes played in Imperial Russia and the way the dynasty interacted with the state, sometimes as a parallel institution and sometimes as a rival institution of the state, or vice versa, I should say. So this is going to be almost the end for us of the 17th century, so almost the end of Muscovy, and we'll be moving on from Muscovy to a sort of intermediate period that will end in 1724 with the establishment of the Russian Empire, Rossiya instead of Rus, and Russia instead of Muscovy. This is not ideal, is it? You're going to have to wear sunglasses while you watch this. Sorry about that. Bad timing on my part. So we need to talk again about the changing foundations of service in Russia, because it's very much necessary to have that foundation before we move on to what the Grand Dukes were doing and where they stood in relation to these two institutions of the state and the professional service class on the one hand, and the dynasty and the Muscovite roots on the other. So the nobles during the Muscovite period were called boyars. If you've been following this series all along, you know that, or if you yourself are knowledgeable about Russian history. So the boyars at this time were becoming more and more obsolete, we could say. So the state was growing. There was still this idea of the Russian state being more or less an emanation of the emperor himself, and there being no state that was independent of him, and we don't yet have this idea of a parallel institutions of dynasty and state. And yet modernization was creeping forward, and it was creeping forward in this instance from the top. Typically, when we think about the Romanov dynasty, especially in the early 20th century leading up to the revolution, we think of it as being the opposite of a reforming institution, that the impetus for reform was coming from the service class, from the professional class, and not from the throne. And there was a time when it had come from the throne to a certain extent in the 19th century under the Tsar Liberator Alexander II, but Alexander's son Alexander III immediately put a stop to that. And so modernization was no longer coming from the top, unless it, as was the case in with the 1905 revolution, when Nicholas had to make concessions or the entire game would be lost. This was a time period in the 16th or the 17th century, at the beginning of the Romanov dynasty, when that impetus for change was coming from the top. The boyars were not happy about it. They were losing their role. They were losing their identity. In Imperial Russia, there would not be boyars. So it was really true that they could see the writing on the wall, that they were being replaced by the professional service class. And even though one thing had improved for them, their land landholdings had originally been given to them by the crown, and they could only hold those lands as long as they were serving the crown and at the beck and call of the crown. And there was sort of that, the idea was that the peasants came with the land, and the peasants and the land were apportioned to the boyars, not as property that could be passed down to their heirs, but as a token of their favor with the throne, that favor being based on their ability to serve and to provide militias when the need arose, and to have roles in the administration of the state. So this was changing, and even though the one positive thing for them was that they more and more were able to pass their land on to their heirs and to approach it as property, they were still losing their prestige and their identity and their role in society. The middle service class, the professional service class, was surging, and so they became more and more unmotivated. And yeah, there was a problem with absenteeism when they were called up for military service, not showing up. And so, yeah, this would be a perennial problem in Russia, I would say, because you would see that certainly at the end of the 19th century, after the liberation of the serfs in 1861, even though everything was slanted in favor of the nobles and the peasants got the worst land and had to pay the nobles for the land and so on and so forth, the nobility was nonetheless declining. And once again, you had this decline in role and identity, and the fear of being taken over by professionals and no longer having that role. And I mean, you see it in other countries as well. You see it in the British Empire, for instance, with the landowners there, starting to lose their estates and that sort of thing, and their seniority. And so, yeah, it was something that kept happening. And anytime you had one of these times of transition, when a particular group was beginning to feel threatened and beginning to think that they have no future, that's when you have big upheavals and big changes. And, then is now. And not only with nobility, but with any class of society who suddenly feels, any class that suddenly feels threatened. Okay, so another one of the traditions in the Muscovite service system was something called местничество, which means placeholding. So the boyars from the most prominent boyar families benefited from местничество, and important appointments, whether they were military appointments to be the commander on the field of these various militias, or whether they were administrative governmental roles, went to the person. There was this elaborate system of seniority within the boyar class, and местничество ensured that the top appointments went to the person who was at the top of the местничество ranking. And that was not based in any way on ability, but it was the custom. And it had been in place for a long time, and it was honored. And again, as in other countries at other times, when you have a system where professional service is not in the hands of professionals, but is made, the leaders are determined by some other criteria, then you have problems. So for instance, I think of the charge of the Light Brigade. And I think that was sort of a turning point in British history, when it was realized that we can't just put Lord so-and-so in charge because he may be complete incompetent. And you also had that in British military history with purchase, where you paid money to buy your commission, and then you paid money to rise up to higher ranks. And so you had tension there too between the professional servitors who maybe attended, technical military academies and got real skills, and those who did it as a reversion to this anachronistic worldview where the nobility were assumed to be the best because of breeding and tradition and that sort of thing. And it doesn't work out very well when it turns out that you actually have to go to war. So this was a time of crisis in Russia, and particularly a crisis for the members of the boyar clans. So the Tsar had always been able to override the Мясничество system, and sometimes had, but it was happening more and more frequently until in 1682 it was abolished entirely. Okay, so now when we turn specifically to the Romanovs themselves at this time period, well, for a basis of comparison, we can say that boyar boys began their service role when they were 15. So when they were 15, they were eligible to be military leaders, militia leaders, and to have positions at court and in the administration. And they too would be part of the Мясничество system. But if we try to compare Grand Ducal service role to boyar service role and tradition, well, we can't, because there were no Romanov boys who made it to that age, to age 15, except for those who were heirs to the throne. And so there were no younger sons to pioneer a service role and to either follow the boyar tradition of starting at age 15 or having some new system that only applied to Grand Dukes. Now it seems to me that if there had been if, let's say, Tsar Alexei had multiple healthy sons, if one of those sons had wanted to pursue or had wanted to retreat into a more spiritual life, even without becoming a monastic or something like that, that would have been acceptable at that time. I don't think, maybe they couldn't have taken holy orders, but I think it would have been acceptable in Muscovy with the Romanov mythos of that time for a Grand Duke to pursue not a military life and image, but this model of the meek and pious Romanov royal. But I don't know. That's speculation on my part. I just think it would have been accepted more so than, say, in the 19th century for a Grand Duke to have done that in official capacity rather than just, I have my military career, but I am a spiritual person, and that's what I do on my own. Okay, so let's talk more about the Tsar at that time. Tsar Alexei, he was Peter the Great's father, and Peter the Great was just his father in a much grander form, in the sense of Alexei was also a reformer, and he wanted his sons to be reformers, and he wanted there to be more of a Western-style government and military in Alexei. And so there was an observer at court by the name of August von Meyerberg. August von Meyerberg. And he was, at this particular time, we get a lot of useful information from foreign observers at court who could make comparisons and write down what they thought was unusual or interesting at the Muscovite court. So von Meyerberg made this comment that Alexei hoped to have lots of healthy children and lots of healthy sons, not just so that he would have a reliable heir to the throne, but to establish his dominion by the number of his children. So that's a quote. beginning with the word establish. Establish his dominion by the number of his children. That is quoting Meyerberg. All right, so that to me suggests that Alexei had things in mind, not just strengthening the dynasty and the succession per se, but really using his healthy adult sons in a service capacity. So, for instance, he himself went to war, or at least a military excursion. He went to Poland, which was a very powerful state at that time. In 1654, he went to Poland on some kind of military venture, and while he was gone, Muscovy was ruled by some commissions that had various areas of expertise. So, I don't know what the ratio would have been of boyars to members of this up-and-coming professional service class, but that was not ideal. If Alexei had had a strong eldest son, if he had had strong younger sons, they could have headed those commissions. They could have been in charge. One or more of them could have been in charge, or conversely, one or more of them could have gone to Poland instead of the Tsar. And there could have been any number of ways that Alexei was envisioning this dominion by the number of his children, because his sons could have been, in addition to these things that we've already mentioned, they also could have overseen and could have been viceroys of conquered territories as Muscovy expanded. And in fact, these would be the roles that Grand Dukes would indeed play in the future. There would be one Grand Duke who was the viceroy of the Caucasus, one who played a similar role in Poland, and there were Grand Dukes who were heads of the state council and heads of the military districts and various other things. And that was a strong point. That was something that did strengthen the dynasty in the 19th century. But of course, there's also a problem with that, isn't there? Because then you have rivals. If you're the Tsar or the Emperor, then you have rivals who maybe aren't your son. As the family extends, they may actually not be sons, but nephews and then cousins of a ruler. And what if they're more popular? What if they're more capable? What if they win over the professional service class in a way that the Tsar or Emperor himself can't do? Well, that will be a big part of what we'll be talking about when we get to the point where Grand Dukes actually are numerous and playing service roles. All right, so we have Alexei's death in 1667, and he leaves behind 3 sons. One of them, Fyodor, is 15 years old, a very smart boy by all accounts, like his father, interested in being not the pious and meek Tsar, but a reformer. There are paintings of him without a beard, and the problem with Fyodor is that he was in very poor health, and it was clear that he was not going to live to a ripe old age. And he wasn't able to have a child before he did indeed pass away in 1684 when he was 20 years old. He actually married twice in that short period of time. His first wife died in childbirth, and the baby died, I believe it was a son, died 14 days later. The second wife, by the time he remarried, he was so sick that it was actually clear that he was dying. He couldn't even really stand on his own feet for any length of time anymore. So why he decided to marry, I don't know. But he did, and his wife survived him, but she didn't have any further role in the dynasty or in the state. All right, so This left two brothers. So the first brother, Ivan, who became Ivan V, was disabled. We've talked about that already. And he was later described as an adult by a foreign observer as being senile, paralytic, and blind. He was certainly blind already, or nearly blind, at the time of his elder brother's death, at the time that he became Ivan V, or Ivan V. But he was able to father 5 children, and 3 of them were healthy and lived, normal lifespan, even long lifespans. And, unfortunately, from the dynastic perspective, at that time, they were all daughters. So the ones that survived childhood ended up, marrying. I think one of them didn't marry, but the others went off and married German husbands, if I remember correctly. But when the dynasty, the male line basically went extinct, it was these daughters who then stepped in to keep it going. But anyway, that's getting too far ahead. So Fyodor is dead, Ivan is disabled, and Peter, who's not only a healthy boy, but big and robust and intelligent and energetic, is only 9 years old. So what do you do in that case? If you are the people who are left to make these decisions? Because, a combination of boyars and other administrators, the last thing you want is another time of troubles. That was just devastating. The previous one, when Ivan the Terrible died, lasted 30 years and was full of, bloodshed and turmoil and foreign incursions and that sort of thing. So what do you do now? You do have 2 boys, 2 little Grand Dukes. One is everything you could want in a ruler, but he's only 9. The other one is, he's also very young, but he's not reached his majority. He's also a child, and he clearly is never going to be able to be an active ruler. There would have to be somebody making the decisions for the duration of his life. So what do you do about that? Well, Fyodor left without associating either of his brothers with him, in the tradition of when your desired heir turns 13, you start bringing him into public next to you so that the public know that this is your successor. Well, his brothers were too young for that. And neither one of them, if he decided to do it earlier, neither one of them would have been able to do that. Fyodor or Ivan because of his disabilities, and Peter because he was so little. So, unfortunately, Fyodor did not have the foresight to name an heir, and there was no law in place at that time saying such and such has to be the heir, disability or no disability, or somebody with disabilities is excluded. There was nothing. And what you did have, however, and I talked about it before, was a divided family, because Alexei had 2 wives. The first one came from a boyar family called the Miloslavskis, I believe. Hope I got that right. And the second one came from an upstart boyar family that was further down called the Narishkins. So Fyodor had been a Miloslavsky. Ivan was a Miloslavsky. He was a full brother to the Tsar. And Peter was a Narishkin. Pyotr, I should say, was a Narishkin, and he was a half-brother to the Tsar who had just died. Well, so the people who had the biggest stake in this at this point were the Miloslavsky family and the Narishkin family, and they were both boyar clans, and they both wanted to see their boy put on the throne. And so, although it didn't last 30 years, we do end up having a succession crisis and a time of troubles, and we do end up having a lot of bloodshed. So that's what we're going to talk about next time. Starting the next section in my dissertation was entitled The Dawn of Russia's Imperial Age, and it goes from 1682 to 1725. And as I mentioned, Russia becomes an empire in 1724, and Peter dies, the first Russian emperor dies in 1725, and then we'll go on to the next succession crisis. All right, so do come back next time. Sorry about this horrible lighting, and I'll see you then. Bye.